I'll never forget the evening of December 24th, 1944, sitting around my kitchen table in a bombed-out house in Bastogne, sharing Christmas dinner with 6 German prisoners who'd been marked for execution just hours earlier. Snow was falling through the broken roof onto our makeshift table, candles flickered in the cold Belgian air, and Bing Crosby's Silent Night played softly on a battery radio while artillery rumbled in the distance like thunder from another world. The aroma of my wife Helen's Christmas ham mixed with the acrid smell of cordite and burning buildings, creating the strangest and most beautiful Christmas dinner of my life. I was Lieutenant Colonel James Jim Thompson, 4th Infantry Division, and after 18 months of combat from Normandy to the Ardennes, I thought I understood the clear moral lines that separated right from wrong, legal orders from illegal ones, soldiers from war criminals. I'd seen what SS troops could do to American prisoners, witnessed the aftermath of atrocities committed against Belgian civilians, and carried orders in my pocket that seemed to offer simple justice for complex crimes. But what happened during those 3 days before Christmas 1944 would challenge everything I believed about military duty, moral courage, and the difference between following orders and following conscience. Those 6 German prisoners would teach me that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against external enemies, but against the darkness that war can create in our own hearts. My involvement in this moral crisis began on December 21st, 1944, during the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Our sector near Bastogne had been overrun by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, and after a desperate counterattack, we'd recaptured positions that contained evidence of war crimes committed against American prisoners and Belgian civilians. The evidence was overwhelming and horrific. 17 American soldiers had been executed after surrendering, their bodies showing close-range gunshot wounds to the head. 3 Belgian families had been murdered in their homes, including children who posed no military threat. Medical personnel had been killed while treating wounded, despite the protections supposedly afforded by Geneva Convention markings. When we captured the German positions, we found 6 prisoners from the unit responsible for these atrocities, 3 officers and 3 enlisted men who'd been identified by surviving witnesses as participants in the executions. They were being held in a basement beneath the ruins of a church, awaiting transport to divisional headquarters for interrogation and trial. That's when I received the orders that would define the rest of my military career and the rest of my life. Colonel William Bradley called me to his command post at 1400 hours on December 22nd, handing me a manila envelope marked "Classified Eyes Only," with the grim expression of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say. "Jim," he began, using my first name instead of rank in a way that immediately told me this was unofficial business, "we've got a problem with those 6 German prisoners from the SS unit. Division intelligence has confirmed their involvement in the executions of American personnel and Belgian civilians." He paused, studying my face in the candlelight that illuminated his makeshift office in the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse. "Normally we'd transport them back for trial, but we don't have the resources or the time. German forces are still attacking, we're surrounded, and we can't spare men or vehicles for prisoner transport. Additionally, there's concern that if these prisoners escape during transport, they'll rejoin SS units and continue committing atrocities." I had a sinking feeling about where this conversation was heading, but I remained silent while Colonel Bradley continued. "Division has authorized field justice in this case. You're to conduct summary interrogations to confirm their involvement, then execute them for war crimes under Article 23 of the Hague Convention. The authorization is in that envelope, along with detailed instructions." The orders were typed on official letterhead, signed by appropriate authorities, and completely legal under wartime provisions for dealing with war criminals caught in the act. But they also placed on me the responsibility for determining guilt and carrying out death sentences without the benefit of formal trials or appeals. "Sir," I said carefully, "are we certain these 6 men were directly involved in the executions? Have they been formally identified by witnesses?" Bradley nodded grimly. 3 Belgian civilians survived the attack on their village and identified 2 of the officers as participants in the killings. American medics who escaped the aid station attack identified one of the enlisted men as having shot wounded prisoners. The evidence seemed clear, but something about the situation troubled me in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Perhaps it was the speed with which the decision had been made, or the pressure of combat conditions that left little time for careful investigation, or simply the weight of being asked to become judge, jury, and executioner for 6 human beings. When do you want this carried out, sir? Tomorrow morning, December 23rd, Christmas Eve. I want it done quietly, without fanfare, and with minimal personnel involved. Choose 2 reliable NCOs to assist you. Conduct the interrogations tonight and complete the executions at dawn. I saluted and left Colonel Bradley's command post with the manila envelope, feeling heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. The orders were legal, probably justified, and certainly easier than the alternatives. But they also represented a line I'd never crossed: deliberate killing outside the chaos of combat, taking lives based on legal judgment rather than military necessity. That evening, I began the interrogations in the church basement, where the 6 German prisoners were being held. They were chained to a stone wall guarded by 2 MPs who'd been instructed to provide whatever assistance I needed. The basement smelled of damp stone, coal smoke, and the fear that seemed to emanate from men who knew their lives were in immediate danger. The first interrogation was with SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Waldmann, the senior officer and apparent leader of the group. He was young, maybe 25, with the hard eyes and arrogant bearing I'd come to associate with SS personnel. When I read the charges against him in German, his response was exactly what I'd expected from a Nazi fanatic. "I do not recognize American authority to try German soldiers," he said in accented but clear English. "We were following orders to eliminate enemy personnel who had committed acts of terrorism against the German Reich." His defiance was complete and unrepentant. He admitted to participating in the executions, justified them as legitimate military actions, and showed no remorse for killing prisoners or civilians. If anyone deserved the death sentence, it was Waldmann. The second interrogation was with SS Untersturmführer Kurt Weber, a younger officer who seemed nervous and uncertain compared to Waldmann's arrogance. When I read the charges, his reaction was completely different. "Sir," he said in broken English, "I was not present during these killings. I was wounded in the initial attack and was evacuated to aid station before these events occurred." I studied the witness statements more carefully and realized that Weber had indeed been identified only as a member of the unit, not as a direct participant in the executions. His wounds were consistent with his story, and his nervous demeanor suggested genuine fear rather than arrogant defiance. "Can you prove you weren't present during the executions?" Weber nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I have medical records from aid station signed by German doctor who treated my wounds. I can also provide names of soldiers who carried me from battlefield." This was the first crack in my certainty about the case. If Weber hadn't participated in the executions, executing him would be murder rather than justice. But the orders in my pocket didn't make such distinctions. They authorized elimination of all 6 prisoners based on unit involvement rather than individual guilt. The third interrogation was with SS Oberscharführer Franz Müller, an enlisted man identified by American witnesses as having shot wounded prisoners at the aid station. But when I questioned him about the events, his story didn't match the witness descriptions. "Sir, I was at aid station, yes, but I was helping to treat wounded, not shooting prisoners. I am trained medic. I joined SS because they needed medical personnel, not because I wanted to kill anyone." This claim seemed impossible, an SS medic who'd been helping rather than killing American wounded. But when I pressed for details about medical procedures, his knowledge was extensive and accurate. He described treating specific injuries, knew proper techniques for battlefield medicine, and spoke about his patients with the concern of a genuine medical professional. "The American medics who survived, they will remember me," Muller said desperately. "I worked beside them for 2 hours before attack came. They will tell you I was helping wounded Americans, not killing them." I made a mental note to verify his story with the surviving American medics, but I was beginning to realize that the situation was more complex than the initial reports had suggested. The fourth interrogation was with Unterscharführer Hans Richter, a young enlisted man who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. When I read the charges, he broke down completely. "Sir, I did not kill anyone," he sobbed in German, forcing me to use my limited knowledge of the language. "I was conscripted into SS against my will. My family was threatened if I refused service. I have never fired my weapon at prisoners or civilians." Richter's story was heartbreaking if true. He claimed to have been forcibly recruited from a Hitler Youth unit, threatened with harm to his family, if he refused SS service, and assigned to a combat unit despite his objections. During the attack, he said, he'd deliberately aimed high to avoid killing Americans. "Please, sir," he begged, "I have letters from my mother, photographs of my family. I did not want to be soldier. I did not want to kill anyone." The fifth interrogation was with Rottenführer Otto Brenner, an older enlisted man who appeared to be in his 40s rather than the typical SS age range. His story was equally troubling from the perspective of collective guilt. "I am not SS by choice," he explained in careful English. "I was transferred from Wehrmacht because of my experience with prisoners. My job was to prevent exactly the kind of killings you describe, to ensure Geneva Convention compliance." Brenner claimed to have been present during the events, but to have actively tried to prevent the executions, arguing with Waldmann and other SS officers about the illegality of killing prisoners. His efforts had been unsuccessful, but he maintained that he'd never participated in the killings. "I have served 22 years in German army," he said with dignity. "I have never killed prisoner, never harmed civilian. I was trying to stop these crimes, not commit them." The final interrogation was with Sturmmann Klaus Hoffmann, the youngest prisoner, who looked more like a frightened child than a war criminal. When I read the charges, he fainted. After reviving him with water, I learned that Hoffmann had been drafted just 6 weeks earlier, had never seen combat before this battle, and had been sick with dysentery during most of the action. The idea that this terrified teenager had participated in war crimes seemed increasingly unlikely. "Sir," he whispered, "I do not even know how to load my rifle properly. I have been soldier for only few weeks. I was hiding in basement when shooting started." By midnight on December 22nd, I had completed all 6 interrogations and was facing a moral crisis that the orders in my pocket hadn't anticipated. While Waldmann was clearly guilty of war crimes and deserved execution, the other 5 prisoners presented complex cases that challenged the simple narrative of collective SS guilt. Weber had been wounded and evacuated before the executions occurred. Muller appeared to be a genuine medic who'd been helping rather than killing American wounded. Richter was a reluctant conscript who'd never fired his weapon at prisoners. Brenner was a Wehrmacht veteran who'd tried to prevent the killings. Hoffmann was a teenage recruit who'd been too sick and scared to participate in anything. Executing Waldmann would be justice. Executing the other 5 would be murder. But my orders were clear. All 6 prisoners were to be executed at dawn on December 23rd. There was no provision for individual assessment, no appeal process, no higher authority to consult. The decision was mine alone. I spent the remainder of the night walking through the ruins of Bastogne, trying to decide whether to follow orders that seemed increasingly wrong or to risk court-martial by protecting prisoners who might be innocent. The snow was falling heavily, muffling the sound of distant artillery, and the destroyed town looked like a scene from hell, illuminated by the occasional flare or burning building. At 0400 hours on December 23rd, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. Instead of executing all 6 prisoners, I would execute only Waldmann and place the other 5 in protective custody, pending further investigation. The execution of SS Obersturmführer Heinrich Waldmann took place at 600 hours in the cemetery behind the church, witnessed only by myself and 2 trusted NCOs. Waldmann died with the same arrogance he'd shown during interrogation, unrepentant for his crimes and defiant to the end. But instead of executing the other 5 prisoners, I moved them to a secure location in the basement of the house where my wife Helen and I had established temporary quarters. My wife had volunteered to serve as a nurse with the field hospital and had been trapped in Bastogne when the German offensive began. "Jim," she said when I explained the situation, "you're risking everything by protecting these prisoners. If your superiors discover what you've done, then I'll face court-martial," I replied. "But I won't murder innocent men, even if they wear enemy uniforms." Helen studied the 5 German prisoners I'd brought to our makeshift home, seeing not enemy soldiers, but frightened young men who were far from their own families during the worst Christmas of their lives. "What do you need me to do?" she asked simply. Over the next 24 hours, Helen and I conducted our own investigation into the 5 prisoners' stories. We interviewed the surviving American medics and confirmed that Müller had indeed been helping treat wounded Americans rather than killing them. We found documentation supporting Weber's claim that he'd been evacuated before the executions. We verified Brenner's Wehrmacht service record and his reputation for protecting prisoners. Most importantly, we spent hours talking with these men, not as interrogator and prisoners, but as human beings trying to understand each other across the barriers of language, nationality, and war. Müller showed us photographs of his medical training, his family, his patients back in Germany. He spoke with genuine emotion about wanting to heal rather than harm, about his horror at the atrocities committed by his SS unit. Weber shared letters from his wife describing their young children, their hopes for peace, their prayers for his safe return. He talked about being forced into SS service despite preferring Wehrmacht assignment, about trying to serve with honor despite wearing a dishonorable uniform. Brenner told stories about 22 years of military service, about the changes he'd seen in the German army, about his efforts to maintain military professionalism in increasingly unprofessional circumstances. Richter and Hoffman were barely more than children, terrified and homesick, caught up in events they didn't understand and couldn't control. They reminded Helen and me of our own teenage nephews back in Ohio, boys who should have been worrying about school, and girls instead of war and death. By Christmas Eve morning, we had reached a conclusion that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. These 5 German prisoners weren't war criminals who deserved execution. They were soldiers who deserved protection, understanding, and a chance to return home to their families. But they were still enemy prisoners, still my responsibility, still men whose presence in our home violated every regulation in the military manual. What could we do with them that would honor both military duty and moral obligation? The answer came from Helen, whose compassion and wisdom had guided our family through every crisis we'd faced. "It's Christmas Eve," she said simply. "These boys are far from home, afraid, alone. Whatever else they are, they're someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's fathers. If our own boys were prisoners in Germany, wouldn't we hope that some German family would show them kindness?" That evening, December 24th, 1944, Helen and I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. We invited the 5 German prisoners to share Christmas dinner with us in our kitchen, removing their restraints and treating them as guests rather than captives. The scene around our makeshift dinner table was surreal beyond description. Helen had managed to prepare a Christmas ham, using supplies donated by Belgian civilians who'd insisted on sharing their meager resources with American liberators. Müller had contributed his medical expertise to help treat local children injured in the fighting. Weber had carved wooden toys for Belgian orphans whose parents had been killed in the war. We sat together, American officer and German prisoners, husband and wife and enemy soldiers, sharing food, stories, and hopes for peace. The conversation moved between English, German, and broken phrases in both languages, but the meaning was always clear. Despite uniforms and nationalities and military obligations, we were all human beings who loved our families, mourned our dead, and prayed for an end to the killing. "Herr Colonel," Müller said in his careful English, "I want to thank you for saving our lives. We know what orders you received, and we know what courage it took to disobey them." Weber nodded agreement. "Sir, you have shown us that American soldiers can be merciful as well as brave, that your country fights for principles as well as victory." But it was young Hans Richter who captured the true meaning of that Christmas Eve dinner, with words that still bring tears to my eyes 79 years later. "Sir," he said in broken English, "this is first Christmas since war began that I am not afraid. You and your wife have given us gift of hope. Hope that men can be good even in bad times. Hope that enemies can become friends. Hope that peace is possible even in middle of war." After dinner, we sang Christmas carols together, Silent Night, in both German and English. "O come, all ye faithful," with verses that each of us remembered from childhood, songs that reminded all of us of home and family, and the peace that seemed so distant, yet so desperately desired. As midnight approached, marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day, Helen brought out a small Bible and read the Nativity story in English, while Weber translated it into German for the others. The words about peace on earth and goodwill toward men seemed to capture everything we were feeling but couldn't express. When the reading ended, we sat in comfortable silence, watching snow fall through the broken roof onto our table, listening to distant artillery that reminded us the war continued even on this holy night. But for a few hours, in that bombed-out house in Bastogne, we had created an island of peace in the middle of hell. The practical problem remained, however, what to do with 5 German prisoners who'd been officially executed according to my reports to division headquarters. I couldn't keep them hidden indefinitely, but releasing them would expose my disobedience and likely result in court-martial. The solution came on December 26th, when American forces broke through German lines and relieved the siege of Bastogne. In the chaos of the breakout, I was able to transfer the 5 prisoners to a regular POW collection point, reporting them as new captures rather than survivors of execution orders. The paperwork was complicated, but wartime record-keeping was often confused, and no one questioned the addition of 5 more German prisoners to the thousands being processed daily. Müller, Weber, Brenner, Richter, and Hoffman disappeared into the American POW system, eventually being transported to camps in the United States, where they would spend the remainder of the war. My disobedience of execution orders was never discovered by higher authorities, partly because of the chaos surrounding the Battle of the Bulge, and partly because I'd filed reports indicating that all 6 prisoners had been dealt with according to orders, which was technically true, even if the details were more complex than the report suggested. But the personal cost of those December days was significant. I'd learned that following orders wasn't always the same as doing right, that military duty sometimes conflicted with moral obligation, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against the darkness that war could create in human hearts. Helen and I never spoke publicly about our Christmas dinner with German prisoners, understanding that such revelations could damage my military career and perhaps endanger others who might face similar moral dilemmas. But privately, that Christmas Eve remained the most meaningful religious observance of our lives, a reminder that divine love could manifest even in the midst of human hatred. The validation of our decision came gradually through letters we received after the war ended. The Red Cross had established a program for exchanging correspondence between former prisoners and their guards or captors, and all 5 of the German soldiers we'd protected eventually made contact to express their gratitude. Müller returned to medical practice in Germany and spent his career treating refugees and displaced persons, many of them former concentration camp survivors. In his letter he wrote, "You taught me that healing is more important than nationality, that mercy is stronger than military orders. I have spent my life trying to live up to the example you set." Weber became a teacher and local government official, working to establish democratic institutions in post-war West Germany. His letter emphasized how that Christmas dinner had influenced his understanding of American values. "You showed me that democracy isn't just about voting, it's about treating every human being with dignity, even your enemies." Brenner used his military experience to help train the new West German army along democratic lines, ensuring that German soldiers would never again be forced to choose between following orders and maintaining moral standards. "You proved that a soldier's highest duty is to his conscience, not to his commanders," he wrote. Richter and Hoffman both became successful businessmen who spent decades building economic ties between Germany and America. Their letters spoke of how that Christmas Eve had given them hope for a future where former enemies could become partners and friends. In 1964, 20 years after our Christmas dinner in Bastogne, Helen and I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. All 5 former prisoners, now successful civilians in democratic West Germany, had pooled their resources to invite us to visit Germany as their guests. The reunion took place in Müller's home in Munich, where our 5 former prisoners had gathered with their wives and children to meet the American couple who'd saved their lives and changed their understanding of their former enemies. "Colonel Thompson," Müller said as he introduced me to his family, "this is the American officer I've told you about, the man who chose conscience over orders, who chose mercy over military duty, who showed us that enemies could become friends when they recognized their common humanity." Similar introductions followed with the other families, each emphasizing how that Christmas Eve in Bastogne had influenced not just the former prisoners' lives, but their children's understanding of America, democracy, and the possibility for reconciliation between former enemies. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Weber's teenage son presented me with a wooden carving his father had made, a replica of the cross that Richter had carved for us during that Christmas dinner in 1944, inscribed with the words, "Peace on earth, goodwill toward men," in both English and German. "Papa says you taught him that Christmas is about hope," the boy explained in excellent English. "Hope that people can be good, that enemies can become friends, that peace is possible even when everything seems hopeless. During that 1964 visit, we toured West Germany and saw how the former prisoners had contributed to their country's democratic reconstruction. They'd become teachers, doctors, businessmen, and civic leaders who'd spent 20 years building bridges between Germany and America, using their personal experience of American mercy to counter anti-American sentiment and build support for Atlantic Alliance. "You know what we learned that Christmas Eve?" Weber asked during our final dinner together in 1964. "That the most powerful weapons aren't bombs or bullets. They're compassion and understanding. You defeated us more completely with kindness than any army could have with force." Our correspondence with the 5 men continued until each of their deaths, spanning nearly 50 years of friendship that began with disobedience to military orders and grew into mutual respect and affection. Each of them credited that Christmas dinner with changing their lives, their understanding of America, and their commitment to ensuring that future generations would never again face the choice between humanity and military duty. The final validation came in 1994, 50 years after that Christmas dinner, when the German government invited Helen and me to participate in ceremonies commemorating the end of World War II. We were honored not as victorious enemies, but as friends who'd helped plant seeds of reconciliation that had grown into lasting peace. "Your story," said the German official who presented us with a medal for promoting German-American friendship, "shows us that individual acts of mercy can have consequences that last for generations. 5 German soldiers lived because you chose conscience over orders, and their lives influenced thousands of others to choose democracy over authoritarianism, peace over war, friendship over hatred." This was the story of Lieutenant Colonel James "Jim" Thompson, 4th Infantry Division, who faced the most difficult decision of his military career and chose moral courage over blind obedience, mercy over vengeance, humanity over hatred. His decision to protect innocent prisoners and invite enemy soldiers to his family's Christmas dinner planted seeds of friendship that grew into lasting peace between former enemies. Thompson's account demonstrates that true military honor sometimes requires disobeying orders, that the most important battles are fought in human hearts rather than on external battlefields, and that individual acts of conscience can have historical consequences that outlast the conflicts that create them. Jim Thompson's story shows us that Christmas miracles can happen even in the midst of war, that enemies can become family when they recognize their common humanity, and that the most powerful weapons against hatred are compassion, understanding, and the courage to do right even when it's dangerous. What struck you most about Colonel Thompson's extraordinary Christmas story? Have you heard similar accounts of military personnel who chose conscience over orders during times of conflict? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual moral courage can transcend the larger forces that drive nations to war. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Major Sarah Angel Mitchell, an Army nurse who violated regulations to provide medical care to enemy wounded and discovered how healing could bridge the deepest divides created by war. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.